You didn't build that habit through discipline. You built it because something was about to disappear. The job, the body, the relationship, the version of yourself you could still defend. Not because you're weak when you fail to maintain it, not because you lack character, not because you haven't found the right system yet. Those are the explanations that feel accurate. They have the shape of truth. They point in the right direction. They miss the engine entirely. This video will not give you a better system. It will not show you how to finally make discipline work. What it will show you is what has actually been running your consistency, and why you have been crediting the wrong force for every moment it held. You didn't follow through because you got stronger. You followed through because your brain calculated a loss it was not willing to absorb. Discipline is the story you tell about consistency after it happens. It's the retrospective frame, the moral architecture you construct around behavior that was, at its root, a threat response. The popular version of habit formation goes like this. Motivation fades, discipline takes over, repetition creates identity, identity creates automatic behavior. That model is not fabricated. It describes something real. It describes the surface. Underneath that surface, a different system is running. The brain does not treat gains and losses symmetrically. It never has. The anticipation of losing something already held activates a fundamentally different neural response than the anticipation of gaining something new. Different speed, different intensity, different persistence. What you call discipline is often not a trained capacity for delayed gratification. It is the behavioral output of a system that has identified a threat to something it has already claimed. The repetition you attribute to character is, in most cases, the repetition of avoidance. The distinction matters more than it sounds. In the late 1970s, two psychologists set up a series of experiments that would eventually rewrite the foundational assumptions of economics, medicine, and behavioral science. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky gave participants two choices presented in different frames. Same mathematical outcome. Radically different wording, one describing what could be saved, the other describing what would be lost. Participants didn't calculate. They flinched. The loss frame activated a response that was, on average, roughly twice as powerful as the equivalent gain. Participants accepted worse odds, took irrational risks, and reversed their own stated preferences, all to avoid registering a loss. This was not a reasoning failure. It was the system functioning exactly as designed. The experiment established what Kahneman would later name loss aversion, not as a cognitive bias to be corrected, but as a fundamental feature of how the brain assigns weight to the world. There is a layer of that finding that rarely enters the popular conversation about this research. It arrives later. The structure that drives this response is not located where most people assume. The amygdala processes threat signals before conscious reasoning has assembled a single coherent thought. It does not wait for deliberation. It flags. It encodes, it initiates. The prefrontal cortex, the planning architecture, the system responsible for long-term modeling, arrives after the signal has already been sent. This is not a flaw in the circuit. It is the circuit's entire design logic. What this means for behavior is architectural, not moral. The behaviors you sustain most reliably are the ones your amygdala has tagged as loss protective. Your consistency is not a character trait. It is a threat map. The system runs on perceived stakes. Low stakes produce inconsistency. High perceived loss produces compulsive repetition that you later describe as discipline. The brain is not building a habit. It is running a protection protocol. Think about the last time a behavior actually held, not the one you were proud of, the one that simply didn't break. What was at stake? Go further back, to the first environment where you learned that losing something real was a possibility you had to actively manage. Was it approval that could be withdrawn? Security that was conditional? A version of yourself that only survived through performance? At some point, your nervous system learned to read the environment for what it was about to cost you. It developed calibration, a finely tuned detection system for impending loss. It became faster than your thoughts. It ran below your explanations. The adult behavior you call motivation, or drive, or discipline, trace its edge. Notice where it sharpens. Notice what it's always protecting. That sharpening was learned before you had language for it. Here is the implication. Most versions of this finding refuse to deliver. The loss aversion system that drives your most consistent behavior was not a malfunction. It was the most intelligent response available to the conditions that built it. A child in an environment where approval is inconsistently given doesn't develop anxiety as a pathology. They develop a hyper-accurate threat detection system that kept them functional in an environment where the cost of missing a social signal was real and immediate. The system was right. The system was, in the conditions that generated it, close to optimal. Knowing this does not update the system. The architecture does not revise itself on the basis of new information about its own origin. Understanding the historical legitimacy of the pattern and being governed by it are not mutually exclusive states. They coexist. They will continue to coexist after this video ends. This is not a comfort. It is a more accurate description of what you are managing. The Kahneman and Tversky experiments had a second tier of findings that appeared in subsequent replications, and almost never makes it into the simplified versions of this research. When participants were given time to reflect before choosing, and when their attention was explicitly directed toward the long-term consequences of their decision, the loss aversion effect did not diminish. In some conditions, it intensified. The more deliberate the cognitive engagement, the more entrenched the avoidance behavior became. Think about what that means for every strategy that has ever told you to think more carefully about your goals. The pre-announcement is necessary. What follows dismantles the most widely recommended tools in behavioral change. Deliberate reflection, when the loss detection system is already activated, does not loosen the pattern's grip. It reinforces it. The brain processing the threat in more detail is not a brain becoming free of the threat. It is a brain cataloging exactly what it stands to lose with greater precision. Willpower is the wrong unit of measurement. It treats the problem as a resource deficit, not enough of a thing you already have. The mechanism running your behavior is not addressed by adding more willpower. Willpower operates at the prefrontal level. The loss aversion signal originates below it and arrives first. Habit stacking doesn't resolve this. It layers new behaviors onto the existing threat map. The consistency holds exactly as long as the stack is anchored to something the amygdala is already protecting. Remove the anchor, change the stakes, and the stack dissolves. Accountability systems work until they stop. They work by manufacturing an external loss, social consequence, visible failure. To sustain behavior, the internal system alone wouldn't sustain. They are artificial threat injection. The behavior holds as long as the injection continues. The question is not, how do I stay accountable? The question is, What does your brain currently register as a loss it cannot afford? That is not a rhetorical substitution. It is a different problem entirely. There's a specific moment this mechanism becomes visible. It's not the dramatic one. It's not the crisis. It's the Tuesday morning when nothing is on fire. When the consequences are abstract. When the loss is theoretical, possible but not present, real but not imminent. You know what you should do. The knowledge is not missing. You sit with it. The system doesn't activate. There is no threat signal. The amygdala has not flagged anything. The prefrontal cortex assembles the plan, coherent, well-reasoned, correctly sequenced. Nothing moves. Not because you're weak, not because you don't care. The stakes aren't live. The protection protocol has no target. The most reliable engine of your consistency requires a loss on the horizon. On a Tuesday with no fire, the horizon is clear. You are not undisciplined in that moment. You are operating exactly as the architecture specifies. The life this pattern builds is not obviously damaged. It is contracted. The territory in which you allow yourself to fully operate narrows over time. Opportunities that don't carry imminent consequences stop generating movement. Projects that would require sustained engagement without a crisis to anchor them get started and quietly abandoned. Relationships where nothing is immediately at risk receive the fraction of attention that remains after the threat-activated obligations are met. You don't register this as suffering. You register it as the natural shape of your capacity. The contraction is invisible from inside it. Doors you stop standing in front of feel like doors you simply chose not to open. Maps drawn in rooms no longer lived in look like maps that never existed. The negotiated stability, consistent in the things that have stakes, absent in the things that don't, starts to feel like the accurate portrait of who you are. It is not who you are. It is the radius of the protection system. There is one implication this topic almost never reaches. The loss aversion system does not only drive the behavior, it actively defends its own operational logic. When you encounter a frame that threatens to change how you understand your own consistency, the system processes that frame as a potential loss. The identity constructed around the current model, I am disciplined or I am undisciplined, is something the system has already claimed. A challenge to that model activates the same circuit that challenges to external resources do. The path of change exists. It is not hidden. It is slow, non-linear, and entirely incompatible with the experience of insight producing immediate behavioral shift. Understanding the mechanism does not turn it off. It has never worked that way. What happens after the understanding? That part is genuinely uncertain, not in a motivational sense, in a mechanistic one. The architecture is real. The gap between knowing and doing is not a discipline problem. It has never been a discipline problem. You came here for a name. The behavior you have been calling inconsistency or weakness or the failure to finally commit, it has the same engine as the behavior you call your most reliable. Both run on the same fuel. The discipline was never the source. The loss was always the source. What you do with a system that runs on threat, in the absence of a crisis to activate it, that question remains exactly where it was when you started. Open, unanswered, yours. The gap between knowing what to do and doing it is not a knowledge problem. It is not a motivation problem. It is an architecture problem. And the architecture runs in a different brain region than the one generating your plans. That split is the next mechanism. It has its own name. It operates by its own rules. If you want to understand why understanding alone has never been enough, watch the next video now.